Hello again, students. Today we begin part 7 of the textbook Music and Appreciation, the 12th edition by Roger Kamian. Our objective for this video is to look at the first 2 chapters and gain an understanding of the developments around the world in the 20th century and to take a closer look at the first half of the 20th century and the developments in music that occurred during that time. So let's get started. Extremes of violence and progress marked the 20th century. During the first half of the century, 2 world wars in 1914 to 1918 and 1939 to 1945 unleashed new weapons of unprecedented destructive force. Between the wars, dictatorships and a global depression caused a massive hardship. The second half of the century saw the breakup of colonial empires and extended Cold Wars between the United States and the Soviet Union, a nation that later dissolved, and armed conflicts around the world. At the same time, rapid economic growth propelled prosperity for many. The principle of equal rights gained ground after protracted struggles by women, African Americans, and others. Extraordinarily accelerated developments in technology and science transformed politics and society. The Wright brothers made the first powered flight in 1903, and 66 years later, humans walked on the moon. A flood of new technologies, including sound recordings, movies, radio, satellites, computers, and the internet, triggered a continuous revolution in communications. Albert Einstein reshaped our understanding of the universe with his theory of relativity. Sigmund Freud probed the unconscious, and Francis Crick and James Watson discovered the structure of DNA, the basic material of heredity. Rapid changes and radical breaks with earlier traditions characterized the arts. Shock as a goal was a 20th century phenomenon. In the decade before World War I, Isadora Duncan's modern dance clashed with conventions of classical ballet. Pablo Picasso's Cubist paintings distorted figures and objects, showing them from several angles at one time, and Kandinsky's abstract paintings no longer tried to represent the visual world at all. In the arts, as in other aspects of life, there was an increased emphasis on pluralism and diversity. Contradictory styles and tendencies coexisted as conservative and avant-garde works appeared at the same time. Moreover, individual artists such as Picasso and composer Igor Stravinsky often alternated between radical and more traditional styles. Summarizing such an incredibly diverse cultural landscape is difficult, yet an overview must include the following developments. First off, the United States powerfully shaped world culture and entertainment, as well as politics and economics. Paris and Vienna, cities that had so dominated 19th century and early 20th century culture, were supplanted by New York and Hollywood. Number 2, non-Western cultures and thought had wide and profound effects on all the arts. Examples include the impact of African sculpture on Picasso, of Japanese design on the architect Frank Lloyd Wright, and of Indian philosophy on the composer John Cage. Thirdly, new technology stimulated many artists. Sculptors used such materials as plastic, fluorescent lights, and television monitors. Architects called for reinforced concrete and steel girders, and musicians exploited audio tape, electric guitars, and computers. Number 4, artists explored the varieties of human sexuality with extraordinary frankness. Number 5, the concerns of women, African Americans, and other minorities were more powerfully represented in the arts than ever before. Number 6, many artists expressed alienation, anti-rationality, nihilism, and dehumanization in their works, partly in reaction against catastrophic wars and massacres. The anti-hero became a prominent feature of novels, plays, and musical compositions. And lastly, since 1960s, many painters, architects, writers, and musicians have rejected the seriousness of modernism in favor of more pluralistic approaches. Postmodern artists have combined different styles, blurred the boundaries between the elite and popular culture, and used pre-existing images and texts from history, advertising, and the media. The pop artist Andy Warhol, for example, painted multiple Campbell's soup cans and heads of Marilyn Monroe. In music, as in the other arts, the early 20th century was a time of revolt. The years following 1900 saw more fundamental changes in the language of music than any time since the beginning of the Baroque era. There were entirely new approaches to the organization of pitch and rhythm and a vast expansion in the vocabulary of sounds, especially percussive sounds. Some compositions broke with traditions so sharply that they were met with violent hostility. The most famous riot in music history occurred in Paris on May 29th of 1913 at the premiere of Igor Stravinsky's ballet, The Rite of Spring. Police had to be called in as hecklers booed, laughed, made animal noises, and actually fought with those in the audience who wanted to hear Stravinsky's evocation of primitive rites. One music critic complained that The Rite of Spring produced a sensation of acute and almost cruel dissonance, and that from the first measure to the last, whatever note one expects is never the one that comes. Another wrote, to say that music of it Another wrote, to say that much of it is hideous in sound is a mild description. It has no relation to music at all, as most of us understand the word. Today we are amused by the initial failure of some music critics to understand this composition, now recognized as a masterpiece. Chords, rhythms, and percussive sounds that were baffling in 1913 are now commonly heard in jazz, rock, and music for movies and television. But the hostile critics of the early 1900s were right in seeing that a great transformation in musical language was taking place. From the late 1600s to about 1900, musical structure was governed by certain general principles. As different as the works of Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms may be, they share fundamental techniques of organizing pitches around a central tone. Since 1900, however, no single system has governed the organization of pitch in all musical compositions. Each piece is more likely to have its own unique system of pitch relationships. In the past, composers depended on the listener's awareness, conscious or unconscious, of the general principles underlying the interrelationship of tones and chords. For example, they relied on the listener's expectation that a dominant chord would normally be followed by a tonic chord. By substituting another chord for the expected one, the composer could create a feeling of suspense, drama, or surprise. 20th century music relies less on pre-established relationships and expectations. Listeners are guided primarily by musical cues within an individual composition. This new approach to the organization of sound makes 20th century music fascinating. When we listen openly with no assumptions about how tones should relate, modern music is an adventure. The range of musical styles during the first half of the 20th century was vast. The stylistic diversity in the works of Claude Debussy, Igor Stravinsky, Arnold Schoenberg, Alban Berg, Bela Bartok, Charles Ives, George Gershwin, William Grant Still, Aaron Copland, and Alberto Ginastera, to name only composers studied here, is a continuation and intensification of the diversity we've seen in Romantic music. During the 20th century, differences among styles were so great that it seems as though composers used different musical languages, not merely different dialects of the same musical language. Radical changes of style occur even within the works of individual composers. This great variety of musical styles reflected the diversity of life during the early 20th century. More people were free to choose where to live, how to earn a living, and how to spend their time. The automobile, airplane, telephone, phonograph, movies, and radio all made the world more accessible and expanded the range of experiences. Through the work of scholars and performers, a wider range of music became available. Composers drew inspiration from an enormous variety of sources, including folk and popular music, the music of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and European art music from the Middle Ages through the 19th century. Elements of folk and popular music were often incorporated within personal styles. Composers were especially attracted to unconventional rhythms, sounds, and melodic patterns that deviated from the common practice of Western music. Folk music was studied more systematically than before, partly because scholars could now record the actual sounds of peasant songs. One of the greatest 20th century composers, Bela Bartok, was also a leading scholar of peasant music of his native Hungary and other parts of Eastern Europe. Studies of folk music in the countryside, he wrote, are as necessary to me as fresh air is to other people. Bartok's imagination was fired by Hungarian, Bulgarian, and Romanian folk songs, and he believed that peasant music provided the ideal starting point for a musical renaissance. Other composers stimulated by folklore were Stravinsky, who drew on the folk songs of his native Russia, and Charles Ives, who used American revival hymns, ragtime, and patriotic songs. During the early 20th century, non-European music had a deep influence on the music of the West. Western composers and painters were more receptive and sympathetic to Asian and African cultures than they had been earlier. For example, in 1962, Hector Berlioz could say that the Chinese sing like dogs howling, like a cat screeching when it has swallowed a toad. But in 1889, Debussy was delighted by the Javanese music he heard at the Paris International Exhibition. If we listen without European prejudice to the charm of their percussion, he wrote later, we must confess that our percussion is like primitive noises at a county fair. Echoes of the gamelan, Indonesian orchestra, can be heard in the bell-like sounds and five-tone melodic patterns of Debussy's piano piece Pagodas in 1903. Another French composer influenced by Asian culture was Olivier Messiaen. Messiaen's novel rhythmic procedures grew out of his study of Indian music. American jazz was another non-European influence on Western 20th century composers. Musicians were fascinated by its syncopated rhythms and improvisational quality, as well as by the unique tone colors of jazz bands. Unlike a string-dominated symphony orchestra, a jazz band emphasized woodwinds, brass, and percussion. Jazz elements were used in works as early as Debussy's Gollywog's Cakewalk from the Sweet Children's Corner in 1908 and Stravinsky's Ragtime from The Soldier's Tale in 1918. The Piano Concerto in 1926 by Aaron Copland and the Afro-American Symphony in 1931 by William Grant Still. For Americans, jazz idioms represented a kind of musical nationalism, a search for an American sound. For European composers, the incorporation of jazz rhythms and tone colors represented a kind of musical exoticism. During the 1920s and 1930s, popular composers such as George Gershwin used jazz and popular elements within classical forms. Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue and his opera Porgy and Bess are very well known. Modern composers can also draw inspiration from a wider historical range of music. During the 20th century, music from remote times was unearthed by scholars and then published, performed, and recorded. There was a rediscovery of earlier masters such as Periton and Machaut from the medieval period, Josquin de Prix and Gesualdo from the Renaissance, and Purcell and Vivaldi from the Baroque. Some important modern composers have been music historians such as Anton Webern, or experts in the performance of old music such as Paul Hindemith. Music from the past is a fruitful source of forms, rhythms, tone colors, textures, and compositional techniques. Baroque dances, such as the gavotte and gigue, and forms such as the Passacaglia and Concerto Grosso are being used again. The long-forgotten harpsichord has been put to new use in compositions such as the Sonata for Flute, Oboe, Cello, and Harpsichord by the American composer Elliott Carter. In the Classical Symphony, written in 1917 by the Russian composer Sergei Prokofiev, a classical orchestra is used, and the texture is light and transparent, like much late 18th century music. Occasionally, 20th century composers use themes of earlier composers, as Benjamin Britten did in The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra, which is based on a theme by Henry Purcell. Modern compositions may be inspired by older music, but this does not mean that they simply imitate past styles. Instead, a traditional form might be used with harmonies, rhythms, melodies, and tone colors that would have been inconceivable before the 20th century. Modern composers were also influenced by the music of the immediate past. 19th century composers such as Wagner, Brahms, Mahler, Strauss, and Mussorgsky were musical points of departure for composers of the early 20th century. Wagner's music, in particular, was as potent an influence as Beethoven's was for Romantic musicians. Composers took Wagner's style as a point of departure, or else they reacted violently against all he stood for. Now let's take a look at some of the characteristics of 20th century music. First, let's have a look at tone color. During the 20th century, tone color became a more important element of music than it ever was before. It often had a major role creating variety, continuity, and mood. In Webern's orchestral piece Opus 10, number 3 from 1913, for example, the use of eerie, bell-like sounds at the beginning and end is vital to the form. If the composition were altered in tone color, say by being played on a piano, it would lose much. An orchestral work from an earlier period, such as Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, suffers less in a piano arrangement. In modern music, noise-like percussive sound effects are often used, and instruments are played at the very top or bottom of their ranges. Uncommon playing techniques have become normal. For example, the glissando, a rapid slide up or down a scale, is more widely used. Woodwind and brass players are often asked to produce fluttery sound by rapidly rolling their tongues while they play. And string players frequently strike the strings with the stick of the bow rather than draw the bow across the strings. Percussion instruments have become prominent and numerous, reflecting the 20th century interest in unusual rhythms and tone colors. The instruments that became standard during the 1900s include the xylophone, celeste, and woodblock, to name a few. Composers occasionally call for noisemakers, typewriters, sirens, automobile brake drums, for example. A piano is often used to add a percussive edge to the sound of an orchestra. Modern composers often draw hard, drum-like sounds from the piano, in contrast to the Romantics who wanted the instrument to sing. In addition to expanding the percussion section of the orchestra, early 20th century composers wrote works for unconventional performing groups in which percussion plays a major role. Well-known examples are Stravinsky's The Wedding for vocal soloists, chorus, four pianos, and percussion, Bartók's Music for Strings, Percussion, and Celeste, and Edgar Varèse's Ionization, which was one of the first works for percussion ensemble. Modern orchestral and chamber works often sound transparent. Individual tone colors are heard clearly. To bring out the individuality of different melodic lines that are played simultaneously, a composer will often assign each line to a different timbre. In general, there is less emphasis on blended sound than there was during the Romantic period. Many 20th century works are written for non-standard chamber groups made up of instruments with sharply contrasting tone colors. Stravinsky's The Soldier's Tale, for example, is scored for violin, double bass, clarinet, bassoon, cornet, trombone, and percussion. Even orchestral works often sound as though they were scored for a group of soloists. Now let's have a look at harmony. The 20th century brought fundamental changes in the way chords are treated. Up to about 1900, chords were divided into two opposing types, consonant and dissonant. A consonant chord was stable if functioned as a point of rest or arrival. A dissonant chord was unstable. Its tension demanded onward motion or resolution to a stable consonant chord. Traditionally, only the triad, a three-tone chord, could be consonant. All others were considered dissonant. In the 19th century, composers came to use ever more dissonant chords, and they treated dissonances with increasing freedom. By the early 20th century, the traditional distinction between consonance and dissonance was abandoned in much music. A combination of tones that earlier would have been used to generate instability and expectation might now be treated as a stable chord, a point of arrival. In Stravinsky's words, dissonance is no longer tied down to its former function, but has become an entity in itself. Thus, it frequently happens that dissonance neither prepares nor anticipates anything. Dissonance is thus no more an agent of disorder than consonance is a guarantee of security. This emancipation of dissonance does not prevent composers from differentiating between chords of greater or lesser tension. Relatively mild-sounding chords may be goals of motion, and harsher chords are used for transitional sound. But no longer is there a general principle that determines whether a chord is stable or not. It is now entirely up to the composer's discretion. We find ourselves confronted with a new logic of music that would have appeared unthinkable to the masters of the past, wrote Stravinsky. The new logic has opened our eyes to riches whose existence we never suspected. Before 1900, there were general principles governing chord construction. Certain combinations of tones were considered chords, and others were not. At the core of traditional harmony is the triad. A triad which might be made up of alternate tones of a major scale, such as the first, third, and fifth. Within a triad, there are two intervals of a third. Although the triad often appears in 20th century music, it is no longer so fundamental. Some 20th century composers create fresh harmonies by placing one traditional chord against another. Such a combination of two chords heard at the same time is called a polychord. A polychord can be heard either as a single block of sound or as two distinct layers, depending on whether the two combined chords contrast in tone color and register. Another development in 20th century music was the use of chordal structures not based on triads. One used commonly is the fourth chord, in which the tones are a fourth apart instead of a third. Harmonic resources were also extended through the tone cluster, a chord made up of tones only a half step or a whole step apart. A tone cluster can be produced on a piano by striking a group of adjacent keys with the fist or forearm. In addition to creating new chordal structures, 20th century composers explored alternatives to the traditional tonal system. This system of tonal gravity, known as tonality or key, governed the organization of pitch from the 1600s to about 1900. By the late 19th century, the gravitational pull of a central tonality had been weakened by rapid and frequent key shifts. After 1900, some composers continued to use the traditional system, but others modified it greatly, and still others discarded it entirely. Before looking at new approaches to pitch organization, recall the basic principle of the traditional tonal system. As we saw in Part 1, tonality or key refers to the use of a central tone, scale, and chord within a composition. The central tone, called the tonic, is the composition's resting point. The tonic major or minor scale and the tonic triad are built on this tone. Because the tonic triad is stable and restful, composers almost always ended with it. Next in importance to the tonic triad is the dominant chord, which is built on the fifth tone of the tonic scale. There is a special gravitational pull from the dominant chord towards the tonic chord, and the motion from the dominant to tonic is the essential chord progression of the tonal system. This cadence provides a strong sense of conclusion, and traditionally it was used to round off melodies, sections, and entire pieces. In summary, the tonal system is based on a central tone, a major or minor scale, and a triad, and there is a special relationship between the tonic and the dominant chord. After 1900, the system was modified in many different ways. The new techniques of pitch organization are so varied as to resist easy generalization. Some compositions have a central tone but are missing other traditional elements, such as the tonic triad, the central major or minor scale, or the dominant tonic relationship. To create fresh sounds, composers use scales other than major or minor. For example, they breathed new life into the church modes, the scales that had been used widely before 1600, as well as in folk songs of every period. Other scales were borrowed from the musical tradition of lands outside Western Europe, and still others were invented by composers. 20th century compositions are often organized around a central chord other than the triad. Thus, the basic chord may well be one that was considered a dissonance earlier. In some works, the traditional relationship between dominant and tonic triads is replaced by other chord relationships. Melodies, sections, or entire pieces are rounded off not by the usual dominant tonic cadence, but by other chord progressions. Another 20th century approach to pitch organization is the use of two or more keys at one time, polytonality. When only two keys are used at once, as is most common, the technique is called bitonality. A famous bitonal passage occurs in Stravinsky's ballet Petrushka, when one clarinet plays in C major and the other plays in F sharp major. In general, the greater the contrast of tone color, register, and rhythm between the different layers of sound, the more we can hear the different keys. A further departure from tradition is atonality, the absence of tonality or key. Atonality was foreshadowed in the 19th century works such as Wagner's Tristan and Isolde, in which the pull of a central key is weakened by frequent modulations and by liberal use of all 12 tones in the chromatic scale. Arnold Schoenberg wrote the first significant atonal pieces around 1908. He avoided traditional chord progressions in these works and used all 12 notes without regard to their traditional relationships to a major or minor scale. But atonality is not a specific technique of composers. Each atonal work is structured according to its own needs. Though the word atonality is imprecise and negative, no other term has yet come into general use. Before long, Schoenberg felt the need for a more systematic approach to atonal compositions, and during the early 1920s, he developed the 12-tone system, a new technique of pitch organization. This system gives equal prominence to each of the 12 chromatic tones rather than singling out one pitch, as the tonal system does. For about 20 years, only Schoenberg and a few disciples of his used the 12-tone system, but during the 1950s, it came to be used by composers all over the world. The new techniques of organizing pitch were accompanied by new ways of organizing rhythm. The rhythmic vocabulary of music was expanded with increased emphasis on irregularity and unpredictability. Rhythm is one of the most striking elements of 20th century music. It is used to generate power, drive, and excitement. In the 20th century, new rhythmic procedures were drawn from many sources, including jazz, folk music from all over the world, and European art music from the Middle Ages through the 19th century. The syncopation and complex rhythmic combinations of jazz fired the imaginations of Stravinsky and Copland. Bela Bartok used the free and varied rhythmic structures of East European peasant music, and irregular phrase structures in Brahms's music inspired rhythmic innovations in Schoenberg's works. Rapidly changing meters are characteristic of 20th century music, whereas Baroque, classical, or Romantic music maintains a single meter throughout a movement or section. Before the 20th century, beats were organized into regularly recurring groups. The accented beat came at equal time and intervals. Rhythmic irregularities such as syncopation or accents on weak beats were heard against a pervasive meter. But in many 20th century composition, beats are grouped irregularly and the accented beat comes at unequal time intervals. In some modern music, the meter changes with almost every bar, so that we might count 1 2 3 1 2 3 4 5 1 2 3 4 5 1 2 3 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 5 1 2 3 4 5 6 1 2 3 4 5 1 2 1 2 3 4 5 6. Count this again quickly and experience some of the rhythmic excitement of 20th century music, which often has a rapid and vigorous beat with jolting accents at unexpected times. For instance, 1 2 3 1 2 3 4 5 1 2 3 4 5 1 2 3 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 5 1 2 3 4 5 6 1 2 3 4 5 1 2 1 2 3 4 5 6. The rhythmic resources of 20th century music were also expanded through unconventional meters. Along with traditional meters such as duple and triple, modern composers use meters with 5 or 7 beats to the measure. The pulses within a measure of any length may be grouped in irregular, asymmetrical ways. For example, 8 quick pulses in a measure may be subdivided 3 plus 3 plus 2, or 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8. This meter, common in Eastern European music, is used by Bartók in one of his 6 dances in Bulgarian rhythm. 20th century music often has 2 or more contrasting independent rhythms at the same time. This is called polyrhythm. Each part of the musical texture goes its own rhythmic way, often creating accents that are out of phase with the accents in the other parts. Different meters are used at the same time. For example, one instrument may play in duple meter 1 2 1 2, while another plays in triple meter 1 2 3 1 2 3. Although polyrhythm occasionally occurs in classical and romantic music, it became more common and more complex after 1900. The polyrhythms of jazz strongly influenced composers in the 1920s and 1930s. Rhythmic repetition of a group of pitches is a unifying technique widely used in 20th century music. Many modern compositions contain an ostinato, a motive or phrase that is repeated persistently at the same pitch throughout a section. The ostinato may occur in the melody or in the accompaniment. The accompaniment, for the example from Bartók's 6 dances, has an 8-note ostinato, 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8. Ostinatos can be found in music from various periods and cultures. In 20th century music, they usually serve to stabilize particular groups of pitches. The new techniques of pitch and rhythmic organization that we've surveyed had a strong impact on 20th century melody. Melody is no longer necessarily tied to traditional chords or to major and minor keys. It may be based on a wide variety of scales, or it may freely use all 12 chromatic tones and have no tonal center. Melody often contains wide leaps that are difficult to sing. Rhythmic irregularity and changing meters tend to make 20th century melodies unpredictable. They often consist of a series of phrases that are irregular in length. In general, 20th century music relies less than classical music and romantic music on melodies that are easy to sing and remember. Melody is as rich and varied as 20th century music itself. Neither can be classified easily. Next up, we will look at Impressionism in 20th century music and study our first two composers, Debussy and Ravel.